Be'ezus Hashem, today's daf is Masechta Zvachim Daf Hey and Daf Hey. We're going to start from Daf Dalet Amud Beis, about 9 lines from the bottom. 9 lines from the bottom, the words at the end of the line, Ashkechan Shlamim. We learned yesterday regarding the four services, Shchita, Kabbalah, Halacha, Zrika. These four services have to be done lishma. In other words, that you have to have in mind what the carbon is. And each one, let's say it's a shlamim, you have to say it's a shlamim, etc. And also you have to have in mind and say who the owner is, so that you do that, then only then the animal becomes kosher. But if you did not, if you made, if you on purpose said the wrong owner or the wrong carbon, then the Mishnah said the carbon is invalid in a certain sense. In other words, the owner of the carbon has to bring a new carbon. Nevertheless, you continue bringing the carbon as a carbon, and it can be eaten as a shlamim, but the owner is required to bring a new carbon. So that's what it is. So we have two things going. You have to have two kavanas. One, make sure you don't shinu kodesh. Make sure you know what the carbon is. And number two is who the owner is. But the Gemara brought a pasuk for the owner. The Gemara brought a pasuk that was distinctly by shlamim. By shlamim, which is by El Nazir, and it includes shlamim, that from there you know you have to do it lishma. So now let's begin on the conversation. So Ashkechan Shlamim, we find the carbon Shlamim, you have to do it Lishma. You have to do it for the sake of the owner. Shar Kol Kachim Minalan. How do you know if other Kachim have to be done Lishma? And if you don't do it Lishma, the carbon is invalid. For example, an oila, how do you know? The chitema, are you going to say? Neilif Mishlamim, let us learn from Shlamim. So Shlamim has stringencies over other kabbanis. Mala Shlamim, or Shlamim has shekain to unin, smicha, nusachim, tnufas chazav v'shaik. Shlamim has this unique thing called tnufas chazav v'shaik. It has the breast and the thigh has to be waved. Plus, sometimes some carbonis do not need smicha, and some carbonis do need smicha, and some carbonis need nisachim, some carbonis do not need nisachim. But shlamim has all these qualities, and therefore the Torah was more strict that it has to be done lishma. But how do you know other kachim that it also has to be done lishma? Ela amakra. So the pasuk says, Zois haTorah la'oila lamincha v'lechatas v'la'ashiv la'miluim u'zevach hashlamim. In one pasuk, the Torah juxtaposes the oila mincha chatas and the shlamim. Hikishin akasav l'shlamim. So the Torah compared all the karbanos to a shlamim. Ma shlamim ben shinu kodesh ben shinu ba'alabina l'shma. Just like a carbon shlamim, you have to have in mind what the carbon is and who the owner is. And if you don't, then the carbon is not a good carbon for the owner. Af coil, so also every carbon, Bain Shinu Kodesh, Bain Shinu Balam, whether there's a change in the name of the carbon or the change in the owner. In other words, you had the wrong kavana or the wrong statement. Be'in l'shma, you have to have it right. And if you don't, then the carbon is not good. And sometimes it's not even good at all, like a chatas. But sometimes it's a good carbon, but the owner still has to bring a new one. So the Gemara asks a question. Well, again, our Mishnah said, let's just have the Mishnah up in front. Our Mishnah said, our Mishnah said, Kol hazvachim shnizbechu shaloi lishman. You shech any carbon shaloi lishman and you get it wrong. So kisherim, it is kosher, but shaloi olu bailan m'shem chayva, that the owner didn't fulfill his obligation, and he has to bring a new carbon. So the Gemara wants to know, how do you know that to be true? How do you know that to be true? Hold on. So the Gemara says, how do you know that to be true? Ema, let us say, Heicha d'shachat lehu shloi lishma li pasli. If you shecht it without shloi lishma, then the whole carbon should be invalid. Not that the carbon is kosher, but the owner has to bring a new carbon. Maybe let's say the whole carbon is invalid. So that we have another pasuk, and I'll bring the pasuk up on the screen. Moitzus v'secha tishma v'sisa kashin d'darta, Hashem alekecha n'dava shetibarta b'ficha. The Torah tells you you fulfill your obligation and bring a carbon like you made a vow, and and it's a donation. Now the Gemara, how could it be a donation and how could it be a vow, a fulfillment of a vow? So the Gemara darshins that im kamash and if you did it properly, then you fulfilled your vow. Yehei neder. That's a fulfillment of a vow. Vim lav, if you didn't do it properly, you had to shloi lishma. Yehei nedava, it's like a donation, but you have to. It's still a kosher carbon, but you still have to do something to fulfill your vow. So we see from there that if you do shloi lishma, the carbon is kosher, but the owner did not fulfill his obligation. So now the Torah said, the Gemara says, we need both pesukim to learn shlamim, and you shouldn't say from moitzis v'secha that maybe moitzis v'secha teaches me that lechatchila you need lishma. Isn't that moitzis v'secha tishmar? Teaches you lechatchila you need lishma, and if you don't do it lishma, it's a donation. The ikas of Rachmana Moitza, if the Torah would just write Moitza, we go to Hey Amid Aleph, Ha Loyada Mamai Kasav Rachmana. I would not know what the Torah is talking about. What makes it something that you didn't fulfill your vow? Because the Torah does not talk about it by Moitza Sacha Tishmar regarding doing it lishma. It just tells you that sometimes you fulfilled your vow and sometimes you didn't fulfill your vow. That's why the Torah wrote the word Zoysa Torah, that all the kabbalas are compared to shlamim. Just like we see by shlamim, the Torah was very specific that shlamim has to be lishma. So also all the other karbanos has to be lishma. So the ikas of Rachmana Zoysa Torah, if the Torah would have just written Zoysa Torah, telling you that all the karbanos have to be lishma, havamina lipasle. I would think that if he didn't do it lishma, then the whole carbon is invalid. It's not kosher. So that's why the Torah wrote Moitza Sasecha Tishmar that it's only a lechatchila digadin. I mean, it's a chatchila digadin means the carbon is kosher, but you didn't do we're going to use the expression favor. You didn't fulfill your obligation, and you didn't bring favoritism to the Eibishter because you have to bring a new carbon. Says the Gemara, a fascinating statement. Resh Lakish al ma'oyi. Alma Oyi, Resh Lakish, Rami Resh Lakish, Alma Oyi. Resh Lakish was on his stomach, lying down. Probably he was not well, but he was in the base medrash, and he asked this in the base medrash. Umakshin, he asked the question. He asked the simple question: how could it be something like this? Im kisherim heim. If the carbon is kosher, yiratzu, then you should fulfill your obligation. It should be something that brought favor to the Eibishter. Vim ein ratzon. If it's not bringing favor to the Eibishter, lama bayin. Then why is it still a kosher carbon? In other words, how do you split the atom over here? That it's a kosher carbon. It's the guy brought a shlamim. It's a kosher shlamim, but because it's not written done lishma, so then the person has to bring a new carbon. So how could it be? Amalai Reb Lezer says, Matzinu, we find carbonis, Reb Lezer, but this is Amalai Reb Lezer, who's a colleague of Resh Lakish. He said, Matzinu, if someone has a carbon, right? Let's say he has a shlamim, and then he died, and he never brought it, so obviously he's dead, so it doesn't bring favoritism, but his inheritors can bring it as a carbon. So we see the concept of sometimes you bring a carbon and it doesn't do anything for its owner. It's not bringing favoritism to the owner. The Tanan, we're going to find the Mishnah, Ha'isha, a woman that gives birth. Now we know in the Chumash, in Parshas Azriah, a woman who gives birth has to bring a chatas and an oila. Let's say, and the first thing you're supposed to do is bring the chatas. So the Mishnah says, Isha Shavia Chatas Umesa, a woman who gave birth, who brought her carbon chatas, and then she died. So Yavio Yarshin Oilasa, the Yarshin, the inheritors, could bring her oila. So we see right away that she brings it, that the inheritors are bringing the oila, although she's not around. So she's not going to get a favor by God, but they could bring her oila. The Mishnah says, Oyla so meitza, but if she brought the Oyla, lo yaviyu yarshin chatasa. And here we come up to a theme that the yarshin should not bring her chatas. Even though she brought her carbon Oyla first, which she wasn't supposed to do that, but she brought the Oyla first and then died, the inheritor should not bring the chatas because there is a halacha by Shem Sinai. Whereas all other carbonis, if the owner died, you could bring it as a carbon. Chatas is a halacha b'Shem Sinai. Chatas shemesi baleha yamusu. If the chatas, the owner died, the chatas should be put to death, starved to death, and die. You don't bring it as a carbon. All the others, there's another carbon called an asham, which is an in between. An asham shemebi baleha. An asham, let's say a person swore falsely, and you bring in a carbon asham. So, and then the owner died. He didn't bring the asham. The yarshim. So there, what they do is they take the asham, the animal, and they bring it into a pen and leave it there until it gets a blemish. Once it gets a blemish, they redeem it onto money. They transfer the kedusha from the animal to money, and from that money they donate it to the Beis Hamikdash, where as a donation the people in the Beis Hamikdash will buy a carbon oila when the Mizbeach is not busy, and they'll make the donation of a carbon oila. That's called yiru. They let it graze. But the bottom line is, we see that there's a concept of a carbon oila that even the owner died, it's brought after Misa. So that answered what Rav Shlokish was wondering. How could a carbon be kosher and it doesn't do anything for its owner? The answer is, we see that concept. When an owner dies, you bring the carbon, even though it's not going to do anything for its owner. Amalei, Rosh Lakish told Rabbi Lazar, I would agree with your answer regarding a carbon oila, the asilacha misa, that comes after misa. Asham the loy asilacha misa minolam. Asham does not come after misa. You can never bring a carbon asham after the owner died. What do we say? That you let the carbon asham graze until it gets a mum, and then you donate the money to the Beis Hamikdash. So you don't bring that carbon after the Misa. So in that case, why do the Chachamim say in our Mishnah, the Chachamim say that if the guy brings a carbon asham and it was shloi lishma, it was the kohen shechted it shloi lishma. So the then is that you bring it as a carbon asham, you continue bringing it as a carbon asham, but the owner has to bring a new carbon asham. But asham is never brought after misa, and the Gemara is linking that in order for one to say that a carbon is kosher, but the owner did not receive any favor, it wasn't maratza for the owner, it has to be such a carbon that people do bring after misa. Amalei, so Rab Lazar said, that's exactly why Rabbi Lezer in our Mishnah disagreed with the Chachamim. The Mishnah says, Rabbi Lezer says that in addition to a chatas that was done l'shloi l'shma, right away it's puzzle, and then you have to throw out the animal. Reb Lezer says that's the same reason why the asham also, because it's not brought la'chamisa. Therefore, as soon as if it was done l'shloi l'shma, Rabbi Eliezer disagreed with the Tanakama and held that the animal should also be thrown out if it's done shloi l'shma. So Rish Lakish was disappointed with this answer. They say about you, Rabbi Lazar, that you're a great person. I was wondering about the Tanakama. But Amritli, and you're answering, that's why Rabbi Eliezer argues. Explain me the Tanakama. Why does the Tanakama say that the carbon is a good carbon, but the Bailim were not Yotzei the din? By an asham, we don't find such a thing, that you can never bring an asham after misa. So maybe why do the chachamim hold by an asham it's still a kosher carbon? Ella Amar Shlaka says after Chalara Pischel and Avshei, I found a pasuk, and this is the pasuk that we saw before. Moitzis Usecha Hainu Davanedahu Kidlael. It's the same pasuk. It's Exeris Akasim. That sometimes if it's a kosher carbon, you fulfill your vow. If you did it Shloi Lishma, you did it, then then it's a donation, and you have to rebring your carbon. So if it's Exeris Akasim, there's no question to ask. Yosef, the Gemara continues. Yosef, Rabbi Zera, Rabbi Yitzchak bar Abba, Yosef Abaye Gabaye. Rabbi Zera, Rabbi Yitzchak was sitting around, and Abaye was around, was in the conversation. Yosef and Karmi, they were sitting and saying, Kasher Lirosh Lakish, Oshem de lo Yosef Lachamisa. B'Nosef le Talmuda Maitu Secha. Rish Lakish had the question of Oshem not coming. You can't bring a carbon Oshem after it died. And that's why he was wondering, why is it a kosher carbon? And we said, because it's Xeris Akosov, that it's still a kosher carbon. Maybe the pasuk Maitzis V'Secha tells you it's a kosher carbon if you did it l'shma is only ema haba b'neidim nedava leisi v'loy l'ratze oshem loy leisi klal. Maybe the Torah is telling you a regular carbon that you could bring as a donation, like a carbon oila, a carbon shlamim. Then, if you did a shloi l'shma, it's still a kosher carbon. But asham, that you can never make a donation for an asham, you have to do an avera bring a carbon asham. In that case, let us say that the carbon asham, if you do it shloi l'shma, it should be a possible carbon, like a carbon chatas. Amalei Abaya said, Rish Lakish Mahacha Pasach. Rish Lakish had another pasuk, and in combination, he got his idea. The pasuk says, "V'shochat oisei lechatas." You're supposed to shecht it for a carbon chatas. So we darshan that chatas is different than every other carbon. Oisei lishma kashera. A chatas, if you did it right, then it's kosher. Shaloi lishma, if you did it shaloi lishma, then it's psula. Then it's an invalid chatas. You throw it out. Hashar kachim shaloi lishma, but any other kachim that you did it shaloi lishma, you're kasherim. It's a kosher carbon. Yochel, I would think Yiratzu that the owner fulfilled his vow. Talmud Loima Moitzu Secha teach you that no, it's not. It's like a donation, and you didn't fulfill your vow, and you have to bring a new carbon. So again, that's the opinion of the Chachamim. The Chachamim say that every other carbon, if you do it Shloi L'Shmam, even in an Asham, you it's kosher, but you didn't fulfill your vow. But in Achatas, we have a Xeris Akasav that if you do it Lishma, it's kosher. Once you start something and mess up and do it Shloi Lishma, then the whole carbon is invalid. Says the Gemara, okay, let's take it one step further. The Ema, let us say, if it comes Neder in a Dava, that's if it's like a carbon oil and carbon shlamim, where you can make a donation to bring such a carbon. Then if you do it Shloi Lishma, then it's a kosher carbon, but you didn't fulfill your vow. Asham, but an asham, arutzi namili rutze. Let's say it's a kosher carbon b'diavad. Let us say that the owner fulfilled his vow. It does not have to bring. We won't use moitzi secha to teach you that the owner has to bring a new carbon. We'll use it only by a carbon oil and shlamim, and not by an asham. An asham will say that even if it was done shloi lishma, it's even better. It's kosher, and the owner fulfilled his obligation. So the Gemara says that wouldn't make sense. Amar Abaya, Asham de Maratzin lematzas amar. You can't say the owner of an Asham fulfilled his vow if it was done lishma. Kal v'choyme ma'oila. I'll bring a kal v'choyme oila. Ma'oila, when a person brings a carbon oila, she'eina mechaperes. It's not because he did an avera. Eina maratza. But if he did it shaloi lishma, he didn't get a favor by Hashem. He has to bring a new carbon. Asham shemischapa. Asham is a severe carbon. It has to bring an atonement. Ein certainly, if you didn't do it shloi l'shma, she'ein maratza, it's not going to bring favor to Hashem, and you would have to bring a new carbon. So the Gemara says you're comparing asham to an oila, mala oila, but oila has a stringency. Oil is not a lighter carbon than an asham. Shekain kol, an oil is totally burned on the mizbeach. And there's no food of the oil, no part of the oil, they're eaten by a human. But an asham is eaten by a kohen. It says the Gemara, Shlamim Yachichu. Shlamim will prove that idea. Shlamim is part of it is on the Mizbeach, but part of it is eaten by the owner. So Ma'al Shlamim Shekain Tun and Nesachim Tun Chazashayk, but Shlamim is more severe than Asham because it needs all these things. Nesachim Tnufas Chazashayk. Oila Techiach, then Oila will prove, or Oila doesn't need Tnufas Chazashayk. So now we have Oila and Shlamim have a common denominator. Then they're different from each other, but outside the Shavah oil and shlomim have a common denominator. Shein kachim. They're both kachim. Oil and shlomim is kachim. Ushchat and shloi l'shma. If you shechted shloi l'shma, kasherin, carbon's kasha, the ein maratzin, but the owner didn't get his he didn't fulfill his vow. Afani Avi Asham, so we'll say that Asham is like the Oilen Shlamim, she Kaidish, it's a holy carbon, Shachtish Shleilishma, and if you're going to shacht it without Shleilishma, it's going to also be kosher of Ve'ina Maratza, and the owner did not fulfill his vow. So the Gemara says, how can you compare Asham to Oilen Shlamim? Oilen Shlamim are more severe than Asham. Ma'ala Tzadishava, Shemahan, She Yeshre B'tzibur. A tzibur, there in the Karbonis tzibur of Musaf, we find Oilis and we find Shlamim, but we don't find Asham. And it says the Gemara, Taida Techia. A carbon taida will prove, because a carbon taida is only by a yachid and not by a tzibur. And we'll throw that into the mix, and we'll have three carbonates that have a common denominator. You're going to ask a question when you go to Amid Beis, Mala Toidish came to a lechem. A toida is more severe than an asham. It needs certain breads will belong. Oilin shlamim yachichu. An oilim shlamim will prove it. Each one has a stringency over the others, but the common denominator between an oiler shlamim and a toida, shein kachim, they're holy carbonash, ushachtin shloil shmam kasha ve'ina maratza. If you shech the shloil shmam, it's kosher, but the owner didn't fulfill his obligation. Afani avi asham, so I'm going to include an asham she kodesh. It's a holy carbon. Ushach the shloil shmam, but if you shech it Shloi Lishmai, kosher, Eina Maratza. It's kosher and it doesn't bring about atonement. So now we have a source why Asham, when you shech the Shloi Lishma, it'll be kosher and it's not Maratza, because we compare it to Oila, Shlamim, and a Taida. But the Gemara says, still, Ma'al Atzal Shavashmem, Shein Boim B'nei Dev and Dava. An Oila, Shlamim, and a Taida have one thing that makes it stricter. It could be brought anytime you want. You can make a donation and say, I want to bring a taida, I want to bring an oila, I want to bring a shlamim. You can't say, I want to bring an asham. So maybe an asham is different than those karbanas. Rava says like this: Zois Torah, the Torah puts all the karbanas in one pasuk, and once the Torah juxtaposes, you can't ask any questions. Hekishin hakasav l'shlamim. The Torah compares it everything to a shlamim. Ma shlamim shein kachin shakn shleim shmak shemei meratzim. Afani avi asham shu kodesh and you shechted shleil shma. It's ein meratzah. So once the Torah juxtaposes it to a shlamim, so we know that an asham is exactly like a shlamim. That shachted shleil shma. It's a kosher carbon, but it doesn't bring about atonement. Says the Gemara. The Torah juxtaposes all the karbanos to a shlamim, but it also in that same pasuk, you could say juxtaposes the asham to a chatas, and just like a chatas, if you shech the shloil shma, it's a pasala carbon. So why don't you say in asham if you shech the shloil shma, it's a pasala carbon? And says the Gemara, ha miyat rachmana oisa. The Torah limited oisa. That said, only a chatas becomes a possible carbon if you shafted shloil shma, but everything else is kosher. So we know that everything else will be kosher because it's juxtaposed to a shlamim. It'll be kosher, but the owner did not fulfill his obligation. Yosef, Rav Huna, Rav Nachman, Yosef, Sheshes Kabei. Rav Huna and Rav Nachman were sitting, and Rav Sheshes was sitting around. Yosef Amri, and they were saying the following: Kashi l'rei Rav Shlokish Asham lo Yosef Achamisa. Rav Shlokish had a problem with the asham. The asham, you never find the asham brought after the person died. You see, what makes a carbon kosher and not bringing about an atonement? Rav Shlokish said, because I see an oila and a shlamim can be brought after the person died, and it doesn't bring it, it doesn't do anything for the owner. It's not maratza, but an asham can never be brought after the person died. Says the Gemara, is that true? Rab Lazar could have told Rabbi Resh Lakish, Asham Name Achamisa. Asham could be brought after a person died. If a person had an Asham, he was supposed to bring it. Then he died. What did we say? You take the Asham, you bring it into a pen, make sure it gets a mun, and then transfer its Kedusha onto money, and then donate that money for carbon oilers on the Mizbeach. So it's brought after the person died. Amalu, so Amalu Rav Shesha says that's not an answer that Rab Lazar could have answered Rish Lakish. Ashram l'may karv l'may sarai. You're bringing it for Kayetz HaMizbeach. You're bringing it as a donation for oilers on the Mizbeach. So that's not really the same thing that you're bringing the actual Oshem after the person died. Says the Gemara, no, that so the Gemara says chatas name mikriv karba moisare. Then let us say that an osham, the chatas name. What are you going to say? That osham is brought after misa, but chatas name mikriv karba moisare. That the chatas also is brought as you see. I said that if a chatas, the owner died, then you don't bring the chatas, you kill it. But there's another thing. If a person was mafresh, let's say 2 chatases, and brought one for the same avera, so the other one, what do you do with the other one? Here, and he's still alive, you bring it, you bring it as you bring it into a pen, wait till it gets a mum, and then you bring it as an islet. So it's the same thing. So Rish Lakish could have answered, Chatas afagav the karva moiser miyat rachmanahu. The Torah, the chatas, even though that you're bringing it but the Torah said who? The Torah said by a karban chatas, a very special pasuk. The pasuk says, "V'shochat oisei b'makom chatas hu," that you should shecht it l'shem chatas, and if not, it's possible, and that's the gezeres hakasuv. That's the answer. That if you shecht it l'shem chatas, it's possible, but if not, it is only if you shecht it l'shem chatas, it's kosher. But if not, it's possible. Frag the Gemara, asks the Gemara, Asham Name Ksivhu. But then why don't you say the same drasha? It says V'ktiroi Hamazbeach Asham Lashem Hu, and then we can darshan that Asham only if you makter it on the mizbeach, only if you do it properly, it's a kosher Asham. If not, it's a puzzle carbon. And says the Gemara, Ahul Achtech Haktoris Eimarim Hudiksiv. That's talking about after you brought the Eimerim. In other words, that who by a carbon asham does not limit and does not passel a carbon if it was done shloi lishma, because you don't even have to bring this stuff on the mizbeach. Let's say you forgot to bring the Eimerim on the mizbeach. It's still a kosher carbon, so that who cannot limit it. Keditanya, aval asham hu loynema by hu ela haktich achar haktoris eimarim, v'hu atzmai im lo hiktira eimarim kosher. The who was written after haktara. V'hiktir hamizbeach isha lashem asham hu. V'hiktir hamizbeach isha lashem asham hu. Well, it can't limit it that if you did it, you can't say that who tells you by an asham that only if you do it lishma it's kosher. If not, it's possible, because you don't even have to do haktara. You don't even have to do haktara at all. It's still going to be a kosher carbon. We know that because haktara is not one of the 4 services, right? The 4 services are shechting, Kabbalah, Halacha, and Zrika. So the Gemara says, okay, then what do you do with the who by Asham? Hu lamali. What do you do with the who by Asham? So that you need like the Rav Huna Amarav, but Rav Huna Amarav taught us. Amarav Huna Amarav. Rav Huna Amarav said, let's say you have that Asham. The owner died, and it's an animal, beautiful animal, and you gave it over to get the mum. You gave it over to the shepherd to put it in a pen to make sure it gets a handicap. But before it got the handicap, the guy shechted it. He didn't. They brought it to the base of Migdash and they shechted it. So it's a kosher carbon, because awesome shenitak liriya shechotoistam. If you already gave it over to the shepherd, and even before it got a mum, they brought it to the base of Migdash and they shechted it. It's kosher. It's kosher. It has a din like an oila, even though it didn't get the mum yet. Because once it was given over, it loses the kedusha of the osham, so to speak. It started the process. And therefore, if you end up shechting it as an oila before it gets the mum, it'll be kosher. So, nitak in, only if it was given over to the shepherd, then we say it will be a kosher carbon. Loy nitak, but if it wasn't transferred to the shepherd, loy, then it still remains with the asham, who it always will be an asham. And in that case, if you bring it over if you brought it and shechted it, then it would be invalid. My tama, Amakara who? The Torah tells you who, Bav Yasa Yehei, it stays in its Kedusha as an Asham until it's actually given over to the shepherd. So the bottom line here is we were just trying to establish the idea of the Mishnah that all karbanos, even the Asham, every carbon that you shecht shloi l'shman, it's kosher, but the owner did not get his fulfill his obligation, as opposed to a chatas. Torah is strict. Chatas who shachat oisa, that only a chatas, if it's shechted as soon as you did something shloi l'shma, the whole carbon is invalid, and of course the owner has to bring a new carbon, but the whole carbon is invalid. A good Shabbos.